Hello and welcome back to Bookish, and welcome to what is my wrap-up for the month of September. I read 6 books in September, not my most productive reading month, but I did read some books that I liked a lot. 1 audiobook, 1 ebook, and 4 physical books. That's what I got through this month in September, so I think I'll talk about the audiobook first, and that audiobook was Summer by Edith Wharton. Edith Wharton never fails to surprise me with the topics she writes about, the frankness, the openness she writes about, and just the beauty of her language and her sentences and the writing. I've read her books physically, I've listened to audiobooks, I've read ebooks of her work, and it always comes through no matter what format I choose to consume her books in. Her quality as a writer always comes through. Summer, I found to be really interesting in terms of the frankness with which it dealt with the problems of young women who, let's just say, don't save themselves for marriage. The story focuses on a young woman. I apologize for I forgot all the characters' names. It focuses on a young woman who has been raised by a man and his wife. The man is a lawyer who represented her father in a case in which he was sentenced to prison. And her father essentially asked his lawyer to rescue his child from this kind of community that to the rest of the world seems backwards and remote, and they have all kinds of strange customs, and it's very poor. And so he does, and he takes this child in, and he and his wife raise her. The wife dies, leaving just the man and the young girl alone together. And if you think that sounds like a situation in which untoward things might happen, good guess. I won't go into more depth than that. But this young woman grows up, aware of her beauty, but also aware of the circumstances in which she lives and kind of the stultifying nature of the small New England town, I believe, in which she lives. And so, she is at once, I think, a character you can feel sympathy for, but at the same time, a character that you see almost like in Shakespearean foreshadowing the problems that are coming. She works and maintains the town's library, which is only open like 3 or 4 hours a day. It doesn't has any new books, and she doesn't care anything about books or reading or anything like that until one day a young man comes in who is visiting kind of the local busybody. He comes in and she immediately kind of falls for him. And over time, she becomes involved in a relationship with this young man. At the same time, she is learning more and more disturbing things about her father and his habits and his treatment of young women and his sexual behavior. And those two things clash on the 4th of July, where inadvertently she and the young man run into this father figure of hers in a city far away in which he's hanging around with young women who are definitely, and we should imply, are somewhere between single young women and prostitutes, kind of occupying that kind of middle ground. And there's a huge scene at which her, the man who raised her behaves abominably and calls her terrible names. And this thing kind of brings this crisis, this relationship she has with this young man, to a crux. And what we learn later is that this father figure of hers has had a hand in creating the problem between them, which becomes a bigger and bigger problem because I think, as predictably we might guess, these young people engage in things that young people and, older people sometimes engage in as well, but that leads to a, second problem, which, young women in her time period, in her community, are essentially ostracized for having. And this puts her in a vulnerable position, which her then father figure is able to take advantage of. So, I think I've probably given away enough about Summer's plot there, but hopefully not everything, so that you can read it or listen to it as I did, and so be surprised. Edith Wharton is quickly become one of my favorite, I think, authors for her skill with language. Her writing is beautiful. Her characters, I think, are vivid and kind of multidimensional characters who you can root for and at the same time shake your head at, and I think that's true in this case. And I just really, really enjoyed it as a listening experience, and I assume I would enjoy it if I'd read it as a physical copy as well. The next book I want to talk about is the ebook I read, and that's a book called Beetlebone by the Irish novelist Kevin Barry. So Kevin Barry is on the verge of becoming one of those younger writers that I am, kind of thinking I might follow their career further and try to read a lot of what they've read. This is based largely on the fact that I read A Heart in Winter, I believe, this year for the BookTube Prize, and I liked it. I thought it was really good. And then when I was reading that, I was reminded that Kevin Barry was the author of Night Boat to Tangier, which I believe was longlisted for the Booker Prize somewhere around 2020. And so I was able to listen to that as an audiobook while I was doing work around the old house, getting ready to move to this house. And I really thought that book was extraordinary. Again, for depth of characterization, for the way in which it immerses you, kind of, I think, in the Irish dialect and accent, and it's just really remarkable. So I thought, well, let me see what other books he's written. He's written 2 other novels besides those 2. One of them is Beetlebone, and I'll tell you right up front, I didn't really like Beetlebone. Beetlebone is a book essentially about John Lennon and his quest, kind of after the breakup of the Beatles, when he's with Yoko Ono, to travel to, for a period of time, kind of disappear from the public world, and travel to an island that he bought in Ireland. That he's going to go there and he's going to kind of disappear, and he hopes not to draw public attention, so he can just kind of has this idea of being kind of one with nature on this island, and nothing goes according to plan, and he becomes kind of like almost like the ward of a cab driver type person who is from the local area, knows about kind of these islands, how to get to them, maybe knows which one is John Lennon's, and he kind of has a series of adventures which are almost surreal. I'll just say they're surreal in terms of who he meets and parties with, and finds himself at one point in a hotel in a small town, kind of hiding out, and the residents of that hotel are engaged in what I'm going to call scream therapy, in which they yell and say horrible things to one another, and it's supposed to be this real cathartic thing. And he tells them he's already gone through that, and he gets kind of wrapped up in this, and there's drugs and there's drinking and there's weird stuff going on, and the press is always hounding him because you can't keep who you are a secret if you're John Lennon in the early mid-70s. And so nothing goes the way he thinks it's going to go, and he doesn't have the experience he thinks he's going to have, but he does have an experience. And while I could appreciate a lot of the ways in which the scenes were crafted and drawn, I didn't care about John Lennon as a character. I'm not anti-Beatles. I'm not anti-John Lennon at all. It's just, I didn't care if he made it to the island. The stakes didn't seem to be very high. And I think that might be partly due to the fact that we know what happens to John Lennon in the 70s. We know a lot about John Lennon, and you can even look up and find out if he owned an island in Ireland or not. And so the stakes felt kind of low in terms of what was going on here. The thing he was trying to avoid was detection by the press, which was impossible, and you figured that out right away. And the most interesting thing was the relationship between himself and this person who drives him around. That was interesting, and their different lives and their similarities and all those kind of things, and things we might learn about John Lennon and his parents and their relationship with one another. There was some interest there, but it just wasn't a book that I thought was great. So I kind of struggled through that, and I kind of hit a period around, let's say, the 15th of September, in which I found it hard to read anything at all. And so I probably went for a good week there where I just didn't read anything. I got through Beetlebone, and when I did, by the time I got through it, Joseph O'Malley's first novel, Starlight and Moonshine, had arrived. I ordered it early, and it arrived, and I was able to read this book, which really broke me out of my reading slump in a real way. So Starlight and Moonshine, you may know Joseph O'Malley because he is mentioned on the channel Too Tight-Lautrec, and Too Tight has taken over all publicity, all promotion of the book. And I read this and I reviewed it. I'll leave a link to the review as kind of an end screen at the end, so I won't go into a lot of depth here, but I thought this was a really carefully, beautifully drawn story of a family in the aftermath of a tragedy and how that affects everyone. The son, who is the youngest, still kind of in high school or just graduating from high school when the tragedy occurs, and his two older sisters, one of whom is well on her way to adulthood, one of whom seems to be kind of stuck in a situation where the middle child, she wants some acknowledgement from her father and her family. She wants to be different, but she isn't necessarily anyway. And then the father figure who deals with this tragedy as well. And then just the greatest character, I think, one of the great characters I've read this year, the aunt, who is at once just a complete pain in the ass and irritating, but at the same time a person who I think you can more than pity, but empathize with the situation when she finds herself and what makes her kind of sad. If you ever had a relative like that who essentially remains single, never has a family of their own, and their interactions with your family seem to be more fraught, more important to them than they are to you, and yet they still manage to, create havoc perhaps in your family. I think that's true here. And I just thought it was really well done, beautifully written, and really poignant and powerful. So thanks to Joseph O'Malley for writing that book, which wrote me out of that. And then I was able to move on and read two books that were nominated for or were long listed for the Booker Prize, neither one of which made the short list, much to my disappointment. The first book I read after Starlight and Moonshine was Endling by Reva. And this book is great. I don't know how it doesn't make it to the Booker Prize shortlist. I haven't read any of the books that did make it, so maybe they're all that much better than this book, but I find that hard to believe. This book essentially deals with three women who live in Ukraine right at the time of the Russian invasion, and all three are connected into the business in which men from the West go to Ukraine looking for wives because they've been sold this idea about what Ukrainian women are like. Smart, capable, at the same time kind of submissive, and beautiful and all those kinds of things. So there's this there, and this is true. There really was this kind of marriage market with Ukrainian women, in which men went on tour to Ukraine to meet single Ukrainian women with the idea of marrying them. And all three of these women are involved in that system, but not for the purpose of getting a husband. One of them, the most important character, and again, of course, I've forgotten her name. The most important character is actually a scientist, and what she's trying to do is save endangered species of snails. That's her idea. And so she's going around gathering all these examples of snails which are endlings. In other words, they are perhaps the last of their species. That's the name you refer to, the last of its species if you could identify it. And she has this mobile lab which is kind of in an RV where she keeps all these specimens alive or in hibernation. And she is participating in this marriage market thing as a way to make money to keep her scientific endeavors going. The other two young women are the daughters of an activist, a Ukrainian activist who spoke out against all kinds of sexist causes and traditions and things like that. And she is, a well-known political activist who at various times runs afoul of the government, and she's disappeared. And so these two young women have to find a way to make money, and the way they decide to make money is, again, in engaging this kind of marriage market situation where one of the daughters poses as the would-be bride and the other poses as an interpreter. And they work that way as a way of making money to support themselves, but the younger daughter, the one who is kind of the one who is potentially the one who might get married, decides she wants to kind of wreck the whole system with a protest that involves kidnapping 12 of the bachelors and holding them for ransom and making a political statement about this thing, because what she hopes will happen is that her mother will come back, her mother who has disappeared and has left them alone. So there's all that, which is a lot, which is going on. And really, I know it seems like spoilers and stuff like that, but really the book takes off once the Russian invasion of Ukraine takes place, and then we see these women having to decide what to do, and they end up going to Kherson, deep inside the territory which Russia's invaded, and they're there as Russian troops move into the city, and all kinds of problems arise with the men that they have kidnapped, their relationship with one another, and snails and all kinds of stuff like that's going on. But right at the moment where all this stuff is happening, the author herself kind of intrudes with this story about the woman who runs this agency to match up Ukrainian women with Western men, essentially making a deal with them where they will go rescue her grandfather. And what we learn is that this is really a real concern that the author herself has with what would happen with her grandfather. And all of a sudden we begin to realize that the author is a part of the story, that this isn't just the story of these three women being told from a remote, that the author's a part of the story, that she may in fact be represented by one of the characters here, that she is kind of, in a sense, in a very real sense, the puppet master pulling the strings behind the scenes, and she's trying to figure out a way to make sense of what's going on with the Russian invasion of Ukraine, to save her grandfather. There's a scene where they're supposed to go save her grandfather, and it's written over and over again in different ways with different outcomes until she can get it right. And so we feel the presence of the author then in everything that goes on after that, and it's just kind of remarkably well done, and I thought really fairly original and interesting book. And the story itself continues after that, which is interesting in and of itself. And then I got my copy of Seascraper by Benjamin Wood. Again, this was Booker Prize nominated, and I am disappointed that it did not make the shortlist. I can see where this book doesn't make the shortlist more than I could understand where Endling doesn't make the shortlist, because this book is a fairly traditional, quiet story about a young man who literally scrapes the seafloor, scrapes the bottom of the sea at low tide for shrimp, and that's how he makes money. He gathers up these shrimp and he sells them and he makes money, and he doesn't make much money, and he lives alone with his mother, who we find out had him when she was a teenager, causing his family to be kind of outcasts in their local community. He was raised by his grandfather who taught him how to do the shrimping business, and he feels trapped in this situation. And the only kind of moments of happiness he has, which he feels like he has to keep hidden from his mother, is he's teaching himself to play the guitar. And all this changes when a man comes to town and essentially hires him to help him scout movie locations. This man says he's going to make a movie. And this then enlivens our main character's, I believe his name is Thomas, our main character Thomas's life, and it changes things. And he has adventures with this man, and that are somewhat exciting and I think interesting to read about. And then, and I won't spoil this, but at about the 2/3 of the way through the book, we learn something that changes everything, and Tom learns something that changes everything. But rather than perhaps making him defeated, he goes on. And all of that sounds a little cliche. All of that sounds like something you've read before, the power of positive thinking, the importance of having dreams. As a matter of fact, those lines are here, and after you read it, I think you get the impression that that was done on purpose to kind of bring you right up to the edge of this kind of cliched story about a young man growing up in poverty without a father, in these circumstances, who, essentially gets caught up in this other world and then finds out something which changes everything. And yet, Thomas emerges from that as such a much stronger person, a much more determined person, and that affects everything about how the book ends, both in terms of his confidence in his music, romantically, friendship-wise, And, you know, all of a sudden people who he had only talked about in the abstract become real people in his life that he talks to, does things with, makes plans with. And it really is, I think, kind of remarkable for that it walks to me right up to that line of like cliche, we're going to roll your eyes and say, oh, not another one of these, and it rescues itself. I mentioned this is one of the books which makes me feel optimistic, and it does for that exact reason. And then the last book I read this month was A Graveyard of First Chapters by Johnny Payne. I saw this book on Mark Nash's channel a couple months ago. I believe it was one of his, I think it was his August wrap-up maybe. Maybe it was July wrap-up. This is a book that he reviewed positively. And as soon as he described it, I knew I wanted to read it because I like books about writers. I'm going to make a whole video about this soon. I like books about writers, and this book is about a writer named Jasper, who is really down on his luck. We meet him as he is essentially, his car has died, he has no money. He had been a successful author, but essentially gambled all that away by being essentially a day trader in the stock market. He had been involved with a relationship with a woman named Vanessa, who had essentially passed him off to another woman who he married, and then that relationship comes to an end. And we kind of meet Jasper at kind of his lowest point. And then he begins to have a series of meetings with people which are kind of humorous, and they almost reminded me of almost like a Forrest Gump situation, if instead of Forrest Gump being, you know, mentally challenged, he was an incredibly intelligent person who was just down on his luck, because things just start happening for him, and he finds out all kinds of things, and a lot of times those things feel really improbable, but eventually this reunites him with his first girlfriend, Vanessa. He finds a best friend named Butch, finds a long-lost half-sister named Inez, and he goes to Peru and hangs around in Peru on a hacienda or a ranch where, you know, his father, who had died, had essentially left he and his sister, and he reunites with a woman who raised him, who wasn't actually his mother, and all kinds of stuff like that goes on, which is a fairly straightforward plot, if, you know, improbable. And as one of the things Mark pointed out was, you know, if somebody told you this story as though it really happened, you wouldn't believe them because it sounds too much like something in a novel. And that, I think, gets at the heart of kind of the interesting aspect of this. Interspersed with the chapters, in which we have this narration, which is a pretty straightforward narration about Jasper and all these meetings and these events taking place, you have these first chapters, the book called A Graveyard of First Chapters, in which, you know, the conceit is that these are chapters that Jasper had started as a novelist, because he'd been a bestseller, had been critically acclaimed at one point, that didn't go anywhere. And they just had collected in his laptop, I believe, in a folder he called A Graveyard of First Chapters. And so we get to read these first chapters, and sometimes you see the connection between Jasper and these chapters. You realize these chapters in some ways are about Jasper's past, things that happened to him, things he's thought, situations he found himself in. Not always, but sometimes. There's always a little element of Jasper, I think, in there. And these chapters vary from things like, you know, being an Incan warrior leader when the Spanish come and then their spaceships, to, I believe, a story about Indian gods and goddesses. And I'm forgetting lots of them, but there are lots of stories like that are these first chapters. And as we begin to realize this, that these chapters are in some way about Jasper, Jasper opens, in this narrated story, Jasper opens that file and he reads through the chapters in the Graveyard of First Chapters, and he thinks, this is my book, this is my next book. So I think that is a really, really interesting way to structure the book, and to kind of combine two things, a certain amount of a meta narrative with these first chapters, and, you know, us reading the first chapters that Jasper reads and decides to make in a book called Graveyard of First Chapters, and this more straightforward, somewhat sentimental narrative about Jasper himself. But I really enjoyed it. I think if you like that, because that sounds good to you, I think this would be a really good book to read. Anyway, there you go. There are the 6 books that I read in September. I actually have a reading plan for October, which is not Victober. I will probably read 1 or 2 Victober titles, but I'll let you know about all that in a video hopefully coming up next week. If you have thoughts or comments about any of the books that I reviewed in this video, please leave a comment for me down in the comment section below, and as always, thank you for watching.